the king who tried to please everyone and lost his head to the guillotine. The morning light in the Hall of Mirrors does not illuminate. It blinds. It reflects off 1,000 surfaces, creating a labyrinth of light that masks the rot creeping through the floorboards of the Bourbon dynasty. Within these walls, time is not measured by the sun or the seasons, but by the rigid, suffocating rhythm of etiquette. Every gesture, from the way a glove is removed to the specific angle of a bow, is a calculated performance of power. Yet, in the center of this golden cage stands a man who wishes, more than anything, to simply be elsewhere. Louis XVI does not possess the predatory grace of his grandfather, nor the sun-like gravity of his great-great-grandfather. He is a man of soft edges and heavy silences, a man whose very presence seems an apology for the crown he never asked to wear. He is a king who wants to be loved in an age that is beginning to hate the very concept of kingship. Outside the gilded gates, the air is thick with the smell of wet cobblestones and the sour breath of hunger. But inside, the air is perfumed and still. It is the stillness of a tomb that has not yet been sealed. The weight of the monarchy is not just in the gold or the titles. It is in the terrifying expectation that one man's will can hold back the tide of history. Louis feels this weight as a physical pressure against his chest, a constriction that makes every decision feel like a betrayal of someone he is supposed to protect. He is a locksmith by hobby, a man who finds peace in the mechanical certainty of tumblers and keys, where every problem has a logical solution and every mechanism can be repaired with enough patience. But the Kingdom of France is a lock that has been rusted shut by centuries of privilege and debt, and the keys have long since been lost. To understand the collapse, one must understand the man who presided over it. Louis was never meant to be the protagonist of this tragedy. He was the spare, the quiet boy overshadowed by his more charismatic brother, until death cleared the path to the throne and left him standing alone before the altar of absolute power. He inherited a machine that was already grinding itself to pieces. The treasury was a hollow shell, emptied by wars in distant lands and the insatiable appetite of a court that treated the national wealth as a private inheritance. The social fabric of France was a tapestry of contradictions, where a peasant could be executed for stealing a loaf of bread, while a nobleman could spend a village's yearly earnings on a single night of gambling. Louis looked at this wreckage and felt a profound, paralyzing sense of duty. He did not want to be a tyrant. He genuinely believed that a king should be the father of his people. But a father who cannot choose between his children eventually loses them all. He sought to bridge the gap between the crumbling nobility and the rising, angry tide of the commoners. But in his attempt to please everyone, he became the vacuum at the center of the storm. He was a man of immense private virtue and catastrophic public indecision. Every time he reached for a pen to sign a reform, he heard the whispers of the ghosts of Versailles, the ancestors who told him that to give an inch was to lose a mile. Every time he hesitated, the voices in the streets of Paris grew louder, sharper, and more rhythmic. The hunger was the first true harbinger of the end. It was not a sudden event, but a slow, corrosive erosion of the social contract. When the bread failed, the divinity of the king failed with it. A king who cannot feed his people is no longer a god. He is merely an expensive ghost. While the Queen, Marie Antoinette, became the lightning rod for the nation's fury, a symbol of foreign extravagance and perceived indifference, Louis remained a figure of tragic ambiguity. He was not hated at first. He was pitied, then ignored, and finally resented for his weakness. The Enlightenment had begun to peel back the veil of the divine right of kings, replacing the awe of the throne with the cold, analytical light of reason. Philosophers argued that power came from the people, a concept that felt like a physical assault on the very foundation of Louis's world. He tried to adapt, appointing reformers and economists who promised to fix the unfixable, but at the first sign of resistance from the privileged classes, he would recoil. He was like a man trying to walk a tightrope in a gale, terrified of falling and so paralyzed by the height that he simply stood still while the rope frayed beneath his feet. He retreated into his workshops, into the silent company of his clocks and his maps, hoping that if he ignored the roar of the ocean, the tide would eventually go out. The inciting incident, the moment the cracks became a chasm, arrived not with a gunshot, but with a summons. The Estates General was a ghost of a political body, an ancient assembly that had not met in over 100 years. To call it was an admission that the monarchy could no longer function on its own. It was a desperate gamble, a plea for help from a king who had run out of choices. As the representatives of the three orders, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners descended upon Versailles, the atmosphere was one of electric tension. The commoners, the Third Estate, arrived with lists of grievances that read like a collective scream of a nation that had reached its breaking point. They did not just want lower taxes, they wanted a voice. They wanted to be recognized as the true heart of France. Louis, ever the conciliator, tried to manage the stagecraft of the event, hoping to maintain the illusion of his supreme authority, while offering just enough crumbs of reform to satisfy the hungry. But the illusion was shattered almost immediately. The Third Estate refused to be a mere audience for royal decrees. They demanded a seat at the table, a vote that mattered, and a constitution that would bind the king himself. The scene in the cavernous hall was a slow-motion collision of two different centuries. On one side, the feathered hats and silk stockings of the aristocracy, representing a world of inherited privilege and stagnant tradition. On the other, the somber black coats of the lawyers and merchants of the Third Estate, representing the future, the law, and the mounting rage of the masses. Louis sat on his throne, the crown feeling heavier than ever, watching as the room dissolved into a chaos of procedure and shouting. He could not understand that the language of power had changed. He spoke of my subjects and my benevolence, while they spoke of the nation and the rights of man. When the Third Estate was locked out of their meeting hall, an act of petty administrative friction that they perceived as a royal coup, they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. There they swore an oath that they would not disperse until they had given France a constitution. This was the moment the transition began. The king was no longer the source of the law, he was now its potential subject. Louis wavered. He sent soldiers, then he withdrew them. He threatened, then he pleaded. He tried to please the hardliners in his family who wanted the streets washed in blood, and he tried to please the reformers who wanted a peaceful transition to a limited monarchy. By trying to be both a lion and a lamb, he became neither. The silence that followed the tennis court oath was the most dangerous kind of silence. It was the breath taken before a plunge into the abyss. In Paris, the rumors spread like a fever. The king was massing troops. The king was going to starve the city. The king had betrayed the people. The fear was a living thing, prowling the alleys and the markets, turning every shadow into a conspirator. Louis, isolated in the bubble of Versailles, could not feel the temperature of the city rising. He was busy with his journals, recording the day's hunt or the progress of a particular lock he was filing. He was a man who believed that if he remained virtuous and well-intentioned, the world would eventually return to its senses. He did not realize that the world he knew was already dead. The guillotine was not yet a physical reality. It was still a theoretical design, a dream of a humane and egalitarian death. But the logic that would build it was already in place. The idea that a single life, even a royal one, was nothing compared to the survival of the state, was beginning to take root in the minds of men who had once knelt in his presence. The king who tried to please everyone was about to find himself in a world where no one was satisfied with anything less than a total transformation. As the sun set on the first days of the revolution, the shadows of the palace grew long and jagged, reaching out toward the city like the fingers of a giant, waiting to pull the entire edifice of the monarchy into the dirt. The tragedy was not that Louis was a bad man, but that he was a mediocre man cast into an epic role, a man of quiet habits forced to face a loud and violent destiny. The machine of the revolution was beginning to turn, and its first and most prominent victim would be the man who thought he could stop it by being kind. 3. The darkness inside the carriage is not a sanctuary, it is a confession. On the night of June 20th, 1791, a heavy, lumbering vehicle rolls through the gates of the Tuileries, carrying a family that is no longer a symbol, but a group of fugitives. Louis sits in the shadows, dressed in the plain clothes of a valet, his identity hidden behind a mask of ordinary fabric. For a man who has spent every second of his life being watched, curated, and adored as a living icon, the anonymity is a cold shock. He watches the silhouette of Paris fade into the gloom, believing that if he can only reach the border, if he can only reach the protection of loyal bayonets, he can negotiate with his people from a position of strength. He does not see that by leaving, he has already surrendered. The silence of the night is broken only by the rhythmic strike of hooves on stone, a sound that counts down the remaining seconds of his legitimacy. He believes he is escaping toward a future where he can still be a king. In reality, he is driving himself toward a destination where the very concept of a king is an absurdity that must be erased. The air in the carriage is thick with the scent of unwashed wool and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Every jolt of the wheels is a tremor in the foundation of the throne. He thinks of the locks he has built, the intricate mechanisms that require precision and patience to open. He believes he can unlock this crisis with a single move, a single flight. He does not understand that some doors, once closed, can never be opened again, and some keys, once turned, snap in the lock. The road to Varennes is paved with the king's own hesitation. The carriage is too large, too slow, an aristocratic vanity that draws the eye of every peasant and clerk along the route. It is a physical manifestation of his inability to shed the weight of his station, even when his life depends on it. He insists on stopping for heavy meals, on stretching his legs in the sun, as if the laws of time and urgency do not apply to a Bourbon. When he is finally recognized at a small relay station, it is not by a grand gesture or a royal seal, but by his profile on a piece of paper money. The very currency of his kingdom becomes the instrument of his capture. The man who was the state is identified by the ink on a common assignat. At Varennes, the momentum of the monarchy grinds to a halt in the middle of a narrow bridge. The local shopkeeper who stops the carriage does not see a god or a father. He sees a man who is running away from his responsibilities. The confrontation is quiet, devoid of the grand drama Louis expected. There are no charging knights, no heroic stands. There is only a small room above a grocery store, the smell of cheese and stale wine, and the realization that the people no longer fear him. They look at him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt, as if he were a strange animal caught in a trap. The return to Paris is a funeral procession for an idea. The National Guard lines the streets, but they do not salute. They hold their muskets upside down, a gesture of mourning or mockery that chills the blood. The crowd is silent. It is a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight against the glass of the carriage. Louis sits upright, trying to maintain a dignity that has been stripped of its meaning. He looks out at the thousands of faces and sees not subjects but judges. In this moment, the psychological bond between the monarch and the people is severed forever. The king has attempted to abandon his post, and in the eyes of the revolution, a king who leaves is a king who has abdicated his right to exist. Inside his mind, a frantic internal monologue begins to take hold, a desperate attempt to rationalize the catastrophe. He tells himself he did it for his children. He tells himself he did it to prevent civil war. He tells himself that the people still love him, that they are merely being misled by radicals. But as the carriage enters the gates of the Tuileries once more, now a true prison rather than a palace, he feels the cold breath of the inevitable. He is no longer the king of the French. He is a prisoner of the state, a hostage to a movement that has outgrown the need for a father figure. The isolation of the months that follow is a slow erosion of the soul. Louis is confined to a few rooms, his every movement recorded, his correspondence intercepted. He spends hours staring at the horizon he can no longer reach, his hands restless without the tools of his hobby. The revolution is moving faster now, a machine that has found its own rhythm and no longer waits for royal approval. The debates in the assembly grow sharper, more abstract, and more dangerous. The language of the nation has completely replaced the language of the crown. To the radicals, the king is a living contradiction, a remnant of a dark age that prevents the birth of a new world. Louis tries to navigate this new landscape with his old tactics of concession and delay. But the stakes have changed. He is asked to sign laws that strike at the very heart of his conscience. The persecution of the church, the stripping of the nobility's remaining rights. Each signature feels like a piece of his own flesh being torn away. He is caught between the demands of his faith and the demands of his survival. He begins to realize that the revolution does not want his cooperation, it wants his disappearance. The turning point is found behind a false wall, in a secret iron chest that Louis himself helped to construct. It is the ultimate irony of his life. His passion for locksmithing provides the evidence for his destruction. The discovery of the armoire de fer reveals his secret correspondence with foreign powers, his attempts to subvert the revolution, and his private contempt for the very laws he had publicly sworn to uphold. It is the proof of a double life. To the people, this is not the behavior of a misunderstood father. It is the treachery of a cold-blooded conspirator. The documents are a map of his indecision, showing a man who promised everything to everyone while trusting no one. The moral collapse is now complete. The king is no longer a political problem to be managed. He is a criminal to be tried. The shift is immediate and irreversible. He is stripped of his titles and his name. He becomes Louis Capet, a common citizen standing before the bar of the National Convention. The trial is a procedural execution, a ritual designed to give the appearance of justice to a conclusion that has already been reached. Louis stands in the center of the hall, a small, weary figure surrounded by the giants of the revolution. Robespierre, Marat, Danton, men who speak in the language of thunder and steel, they argue that the king must die so that the republic may live. It is a cold mathematical equation where a human life is balanced against an ideological necessity. Louis defends himself with a surprising, quiet courage. He answers the charges with the logic of a man who still believes in the old world, who still believes that his intentions matter more than his results. But the room is filled with the spirit of the guillotine, a presence that does not care about intentions. The guillotine is the final auditor of the revolution, the machine that resolves all contradictions with a single swift motion. As the votes are cast one by one in a public display of political theater, Louis hears his fate being decided not by the law, but by fear. Each yes for death is a brick in the wall that is closing around him. He realizes that he was never being tried for what he did, but for what he represented. He was the living embodiment of an ancient order, and for the new order to be born, the old one must be bled dry. The transition from a man who tried to please everyone to a man who is hated by all is finished. He is left with nothing but the silence of his cell and the looming shadow of the machine that is waiting for him in the square, a silent spectator that has been watching him since the moment he first placed the crown upon his head. 4. The drumbeat begins, long before the sun rises over the grey rooftops of Paris. It is a persistent, hollow sound, a rhythmic pulse that seems to emerge from the earth itself, drowning out the domestic noises of a city waking up to a cold, damp January morning. In the tower of the temple, Louis Capet, the man who was once the sun's representative on earth, listens to the percussion of his own end. He has spent his last night in prayer and silence, a final retreat into the internal world, where he has always felt more at home than in the halls of Versailles. The morning air is sharp with frost, a biting cold that seeps through the stone walls and settles in the marrow of the bone. He is no longer surrounded by the perfumed whispers of courtiers or the heavy velvet of royal robes. He is dressed in a simple brown coat, a man stripped of his mythology, preparing for the most public moment of his private life. The transition from a king to a prisoner is complete, and all that remains is the transition from a prisoner to a memory. The drums do not stop. They are a wall of noise designed to prevent any words of reconciliation or rebellion from reaching the ears of the people. The revolution has learned that a king's voice is a dangerous thing, even when he has lost his crown. The journey to the Place de la Révolution is a slow, agonizing crawl through a city that has become a fortress. 80,000 armed men line the route, a sea of bayonets and tricolour cockades intended to ensure that the silence of the crowd remains unbroken. Louis sits in the carriage, his confessor by his side, reciting the prayers for the dying. He looks out at the faces of his former subjects and sees neither hatred nor love but a terrifying clinical curiosity. He is a specimen of an extinct era, being transported to the laboratory of the future. The carriage is a rolling cage, and every jolt over the uneven cobblestones is a reminder of the collapse of the order he was born to uphold. He thinks of the locks he could never quite fix, the mechanisms that resisted his touch, and he realizes that the revolutionary machine is the ultimate lock, one that is designed to close forever with a single, irreversible motion. The psychological weight of the moment is not found in the fear of pain, but in the profound existential loneliness of a man who realized too late that power is not a gift from God, but a temporary loan from the people, one that can be recalled at any moment with interest paid in blood. The guillotine stands in the center of the square, a tall skeletal frame of wood and steel that dominates the horizon. It is not an instrument of torture. It is a masterpiece of bureaucratic efficiency. It does not discriminate. It does not hesitate. It does not feel. It is the silent character in this drama, a machine that has replaced the king as the ultimate arbiter of life and death. As Louis steps out of the carriage, the cold wind catches his hair, and for a moment the drums falter. He looks up at the blade, reflecting the pale, sickly light of the winter sun. It is a clean, geometric shape, a triangular promise of an ending that is both swift and egalitarian. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, approaches with the tools of his trade. There is a brief, sharp struggle when they attempt to bind his hands. For a fleeting second, the spirit of the Bourbon kings flares up in him, a refusal to be treated like a common thief. But the resistance is short-lived. He submits, allowing his hands to be tied behind his back, a final act of obedience to a force greater than himself. He climbs the steps of the scaffold with a steady gait, a man who has finally found a role he can play with conviction. He stands at the edge of the platform and signals for the drums to stop. To the surprise of everyone, they obey. In that brief, miraculous pocket of silence, Louis speaks. His voice is clear, carrying across the square with a strength he rarely showed in the council chambers. He declares his innocence. He forgives those who are putting him to death, and he prays that his blood will not fall back upon France. He tries to say more, to reach the hearts of the men and women who are watching him die, but the order is given, and the drums roar back to life, swallowing his last testament in a thunder of animal hide and wood. He is pushed back toward the plank, his neck positioned in the hollow of the wood. The world narrows down to the smell of old oak and the cold touch of the iron collar. He sees the basket, he sees the ground, and then, for a heartbeat, he sees nothing at all. The release of the blade is a sound like a heavy sigh, a metallic shick that marks the precise moment 1,000 years of monarchy are severed from the body of the nation. The aftermath is not a celebration, but a collective intake of breath. When the executioner lifts the head to show it to the crowd, the response is a confused mixture of cheers and a hollow, haunting silence. People rush forward to dip their handkerchiefs in the blood that pools beneath the scaffold, seeking a macabre relic of a divinity they no longer believe in. They want to touch the reality of the king's death, to prove to themselves that the man who was once a god bled just like a baker or a soldier. But as the body is carted away to an unmarked grave, a new kind of fear begins to settle over the city. The execution of the king has not ended the revolution. It has merely removed the last restraint. The machine that consumed the monarch is now hungry for more. The guillotine will not be satisfied with a single royal head. It has tasted the blood of the highest in the land, and now it will begin to seek out the enemies of the state among the common, the quiet, and the innocent. The moral collapse of the old world has left a void that will be filled by the terror, a period where the only law is suspicion and the only safety is silence. Louis XVI was not a monster. He was a man of moderate virtues who was crushed by a time of immoderate vices. His failure was not a lack of kindness, but a lack of clarity. He tried to please everyone, and in doing so, he betrayed the one thing a leader must provide: direction. He believed that he could navigate a hurricane by being gentle with the wind. His death reveals the uncomfortable truth that in times of systemic disintegration, innocence is not a shield, and good intentions are not a policy. Power is a predatory thing. It abhors a vacuum. And when a leader wavers, the machine of history will find someone or something to take his place. The guillotine was the logical conclusion to a decade of indecision, a procedural answer to a man who could not choose a side. What would you have done in his position? Would you have been the one to sign the decrees that went against your soul, simply to survive another day? Would you have been the one in the crowd, dipping your cloth in the blood of a man you once called father, caught up in the fever of a mob that promised you a freedom it could not deliver? Or would you have been the one standing silently by, watching the blade fall, hoping that by remaining invisible you might escape the notice of the machine. History shows us that survival often becomes a form of complicity. The tragedy of the French Revolution is not just the death of a king, but the realization that when the structures of society collapse, the line between the victim and the executioner becomes dangerously thin. We like to think of ourselves as the heroes of our own stories, but history suggests we are more likely to be the ones waiting in the cold morning air, listening to the drums and wondering when the machine will eventually turn its gaze toward us. The king lost his head because he tried to hold on to a world that no longer existed, but the people who killed him soon found that the new world they created was far more demanding and far less merciful than the one they had destroyed. The silence that follows the fall of the blade is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a long, dark night where everyone is a suspect and no one is safe.